I want to tell you something I have never fully said out loud, not in the courtroom, not in the press conference where I stood in front of cameras and read a statement that had been prepared by lawyers who understood what the moment required better than I did. Not in the interviews that followed, where every question was shaped by what the record already showed, and every answer I gave was measured against a version of events that had already been decided before I opened my mouth. I want to tell you what it actually felt like. From the inside, from the place where the decisions were made and the consequences were lived and the understanding of what I had done arrived, not all at once, but slowly in pieces across years that I would not wish on anyone who had not earned them. My name is Marion Jones. I won 5 medals at the Sydney Olympics in 2000. 3 of them were gold. I was called the fastest woman in the world. I was on the covers of magazines and in television commercials and at the center of a story that the sport of athletics had been waiting to tell for years. A Black woman from Los Angeles who had survived a childhood that did not offer obvious routes to an Olympic podium and had found one anyway. The story wrote itself. The world celebrated it. I celebrated it. And then I destroyed it. Not slowly, not through a series of small mistakes that accumulated into something larger than I had intended. I made specific choices on specific days with the specific knowledge that what I was doing carried consequences I was choosing not to think about. And everything that followed the investigations, the stripped medals, the guilty plea, the prison sentence was the consequence of those choices arriving in the order that consequences always arrive. At 49, I am finally ready to tell you exactly what happened. Not the version that the court documents contain, the version that lived inside the court documents, the one that only I have ever fully known. I grew up in Los Angeles in a household that understood hard work before it understood anything else. My mother worked. My stepfather worked. The message in our home was never complicated. You earn what you have and you protect what you earn, and you do not look for shortcuts because shortcuts are where the trouble lives. I absorbed that message the way children absorb messages from parents they love and respect, completely, without examining it, as a framework for everything that followed. I discovered running the way some people discover it, by being fast, before I understood that fast was something the world would eventually care about. By the time I reached high school, the times I was running were attracting attention that felt less like recognition and more like obligation. Something was expected of me, something specific, something measurable, something that would eventually require me to stand on a track in front of a crowd and perform at a level that the attention implied. I went to the University of North Carolina on a basketball scholarship before track and field pulled me back. I was good enough at basketball that the professional game was a realistic conversation, not a fantasy. But sprinting was something different. Sprinting was where I understood myself most completely, where the gap between who I was in ordinary life and who I could be in competition felt smallest, where the work I put in translated directly into results that I could control in a way that almost nothing else in life allows. I trained with a seriousness that the results eventually reflected. By the late 1990s, I was among the best female sprinters in the world, not approaching the top at it. the 100 meters, the 200 meters, the long jump, multiple events, multiple disciplines, a range that most athletes at that level had stopped attempting years earlier because the sports demands make specialization the rational choice. I refused the rational choice. I wanted everything the sport had to offer, and I trained as though wanting it was sufficient to produce it. By the time Sydney arrived, I believed that was true, that the wanting and the work and the years of preparation had built something clean, something I had earned in the way my mother and stepfather had taught me things were supposed to be earned. I was wrong about that, but I did not know it yet. The Sydney Olympics in 2000 were the moment the story reached its public peak. 5 medals, 3 gold, 1 silver, 1 bronze, across 5 events in 10 days. A performance that the athletics world responded to with the kind of attention that changes the relationship between an athlete and the public permanently. I was not just a champion in Sydney, I was the story of the games. The face on the front pages, the name in the conversations that happened in living rooms and offices and school classrooms in countries whose languages I did not speak. I stood on those podiums and felt something I want to describe accurately, because accuracy is what this is about now. I felt proud, genuinely, completely, without reservation. The races had been real. The times had been real. The competition had been fierce, and the victories had been produced on a track in front of the world. And the medals were physical objects I could hold, and the feeling attached to them was not manufactured or conditional. What I was not thinking about in those moments, what I had trained myself with considerable deliberate effort not to think about, was the substance. The decision had been made before Sydney, not casually, not without awareness of what it meant. I had made a choice that existed in direct contradiction to everything my childhood had taught me about earning what you have. I had told myself the story that people in that position tell themselves, that the substance was not what the rules said it was, that the medical explanation was legitimate, that the line between what was permitted and what was not was less clear than the rule book suggested, and that I was operating in the ambiguous space between them rather than on the wrong side of a line that was in fact very clearly drawn. I knew the line was clearly drawn. I chose to stand on the wrong side of it and tell myself I was standing somewhere else. That is the thing I have spent the most time with across the years that followed Sydney. Not the legal consequences, not the strip medals or the return prize money or the prison sentence, the specific moment of self-deception that made all of it possible. The decision to look directly at what I was doing and choose a version of it that allowed me to continue. The world did not find out immediately. That is one of the things that makes the story of what I did more complicated than the clean narrative of caught and punished that the public record suggests. I competed after Sydney. I continued winning. I continued being Marion Jones, the fastest woman in the world, the face of American track and field, the person whose name attached itself to the sport in a way that made me simultaneously its greatest asset, and though I did not know it yet in those terms, its most significant liability. The United States Anti-Doping Agency began investigating. The Bay Area Laboratory Cooperative, BALCO, became the center of a federal investigation that extended far beyond athletics and touched professional baseball and football and the entire landscape of American sport. And at the center of that investigation, connected by evidence that accumulated slowly and then all at once, was my name. I denied it. Publicly, repeatedly, with a conviction in my voice that I was producing not because I believed what I was saying, but because I had convinced myself that believing it was possible and that conviction was therefore available to me. I looked at cameras and told journalists that I had never used performance-enhancing substances, and I said it with the composure of someone who had spent years learning how to occupy the center of public attention without revealing what was happening at the edges. The composure held longer than it should have, longer than the evidence warranted. And in the gap between what the evidence was showing and what I was publicly saying, I made another choice that the first choice had made inevitable. I lied to federal investigators, not about the substances, about financial transactions connected to a check fraud scheme involving my former coach and business associates. The lie to the investigators was the lie that the legal system was eventually able to prove. And it was the lie that produced the criminal charge, that produced the guilty plea, that produced the sentence. I stood in a federal courtroom in 2007 and pleaded guilty to making false statements to federal agents. I read a statement acknowledging what I had done. I looked at the cameras one final time as Marion Jones, Olympic champion, and understood that the next time I appeared in public, it would be as something the cameras would frame differently. 6 months. That is the sentence I served at the Federal Medical Center Carswell in Fort Worth, Texas. 6 months in a federal prison facility, separated from my children, separated from the life I had built, living inside the consequences of decisions I had made on specific days when I had understood exactly what I was choosing and had chosen it anyway. I want to be honest about what prison was, because honesty is the only thing I have left that belongs entirely to me. It was not what the dramatic version of the story requires it to be. It was not violent or terrifying in the ways that prison is described by people who have not been inside one. It was something quieter and in some ways more difficult than the dramatic version. It was time. Extended, unstructured, unoccupied time in which the only thing available to think about was the sequence of decisions that had produced the room I was sitting in. I thought about my mother, about the household I had grown up in and the message it had carried and the distance between that message and the choices I had made. I thought about my children who were being raised for 6 months without me present, because I had decided on specific days that certain things were more important than the consequences of those decisions arriving in the lives of people who had not made them. I thought about the other athletes, the ones who had competed against me in Sydney and in the years that followed, the ones who had lost to me on days when the margin of victory had been produced by something other than what they were putting into their own preparation, the ones who had gone home with silver medals or no medals and had carried those results as part of their competitive record without knowing the full context of what they had been competing against. That was the part that stayed longest. Not my own loss. The medals were gone before the sentence was handed down, stripped by the International Olympic Committee in 2007 when I returned them, along with the statement that I had used a prohibited substance before Sydney. My own loss, I could process because it was mine to process. What I could not process with the same ease was what my choices had cost people who had never chosen anything except to compete cleanly and accept whatever result that produced. I came out of prison in September 2008. The Beijing Olympics were happening. The sport I had given 20 years of my life to was continuing without me, as sports continue without every athlete who leaves them, because the sport is larger than any individual who has ever competed in it. I rebuilt, not quickly, not in the way that redemption narratives are sometimes constructed, where the lesson is learned and the character is reformed and the story resolves into something the audience can feel comfortable with slowly, with the understanding that rebuilding after the specific kind of damage I had done to my own life was not something that produced a clean ending. It produced a different life, one that carried the previous life inside it permanently. I became involved in education. I worked with young athletes. I spoke in schools about choices and consequences in a way that I could not have spoken before the choices and the consequences had arrived in my own life with the specificity they arrived with. The credibility I had as someone who had been to the top of the sport and then to a federal prison facility was a different kind of credibility from the one I had carried as an Olympic champion. Less glamorous, more useful. What I finally understood, and this is the thing I most want to say clearly, because it is the thing that took the longest to understand, is that the destruction was never really about the substance or the investigation or the courtroom or the prison. Those were consequences. The destruction happened on the specific days when I made the specific choices that set all of it in motion. The destruction happened in private, in moments that no camera captured and no investigator documented, when I decided that what I wanted was more important than what I knew was right. I had been taught differently, I knew differently, and I chose differently anyway. At 49, I am not asking for the understanding that I did not earn. I am not constructing a version of the story that distributes the responsibility across a system or a culture or a set of pressures that made the choices feel inevitable. They were not inevitable. They were mine. 5 Olympic medals, a federal prison sentence, a rebuilt life that carries both of those things permanently and has learned across years that required the learning to be honest about what each of them actually cost. I destroyed my own life, and I did it with full knowledge of what I was doing. That is the truth I finally admitted to myself first, then to everyone else. The medals that were mine for 7 years are in the possession of the International Olympic Committee. The women who finished behind me in Sydney have had their results corrected in the record books. The sport moved forward the way sports move forward, with the next generation of athletes, the next set of records, the next story to tell. I moved forward too, not back to what I was, forward to something different, something that does not carry the weight of performance, but carries a different weight entirely. The weight of having lived through the full consequence of choices I made when I was young enough to believe that consequences were something that happened to other people. They are not. They happen to everyone. They happen to me. And at 49, the most honest thing I can tell you is that I am grateful for that. Not for the prison or the stripped medals or the years of rebuilding, for the understanding, for the specific, hard-won knowledge that what you do when nobody is watching is the most important thing you ever do. I had 5 Olympic medals, then I went to prison, and somewhere between those two facts lies the story of every choice I made in between. I finally told it